By one man sin entered into this world, and by sin death, and so death passed upon all men, in whom all have sinned. Man, having revolted against God, felt instantaneously a revolt in his own being. His sensitive nature rebels against his reason. The disaster that overtook the human race through original sin was one of appalling magnitude. The tie that bound the human will to the divine in loving subjection being snapped, divine charity was straightway extinguished. Charity had been the bond of all creation. It had preserved order in man's own being. It bound him to his fellows. It linked all with God. Harmony disappeared with charity. The creation broke up into a welter of warring elements, for sin works as a force of disintegration. The rebellion against God had its echo in man's own interior being. The willing subjection of the sensitive nature to reason abruptly ended. The orders of reason were first resisted, then flouted. In the state of justice, a stream of delight had overflowed from the higher faculties on the lower. This stream was now dried at its source. Pleasure and delight no longer came from above. The senses clamored in vain to the spirit for the gratification for which they hungered. The little ones have asked for bread, and there was none to break it to them. They that were fed delicately have died in the streets. They that were brought up in scarlet have embraced the dung. Starved because of the inability of the spiritual faculties to supply their wants, the appetite of tendencies of the sensitive nature, deaf to the remonstrances of reason, sought the satisfaction of their cravings wherever such satisfaction offered itself. Taste, touch, sight, hearing, imagination, and memory, each pursued what promised gratification, indifferent to the welfare of the person. What is called the animal nature in man fell from the dignity of the participated reason it had enjoyed in the state of original justice. What rendered man's state all the more pitiable was that, the natural light of his intelligence not being eclipsed, he could still see and condemn the disorder in himself, and yet remain practically powerless to check it. There was found a mocking irony in the false words of Satan. Adam had tasted of the tree of knowledge of good and evil. He knew what was good and was unable to accomplish it. He knew what was evil and was powerless to avoid it. God knows evil without experiencing it in himself. It is not so with man, who knows it by contact with it, by finding himself enmeshed in its toils. No wonder the absurd pretensions of the creature earned the divine mockery. And God said, when he had clothed the nakedness of the first man and the first woman, Behold, Adam is become as one of us, knowing good and evil. Nature itself revolts against man. The earth yields him sustenance only at the cost of severe toil. By the prevarication of him who was appointed by God the Lord of creation, creatures were violently wrested from the course traced for them by God's providence. Created to proclaim God's glory, they were made to serve man's lust. They were torn from that mediate, though perfect, orientation toward God which had been theirs when they ministered to man in the state of innocence. For the creature was made subject to vanity, not willingly, but by the reason of him that made it subject. For we know that every creature groaneth and travaileth in pain until now. The earth reflects the rebellion of its master. Man's effort to retain his despotic control over the exterior world met with stubborn resistance. Labor sustained and toilsome had to be endured if he is to extract from the unwilling earth what is needed to maintain him in life. Let him relax his efforts for a while, and the fruitful land becomes a howling wilderness. "Cursed is the earth in thy work," said God to Adam. "With labor and toil shalt thou eat thereof all the days of thy life. Thorns and thistles shall it bring forth to thee, and thou shalt eat the herbs of the earth. In the sweat of thy face shalt thou eat bread, till thou return to the earth out of which thou wast taken." With the banishment from the garden of paradise, where all men's needs were supplied without any painful effort on his part, began that dire struggle for existence, that life of hardship, pain, and danger, which has remained man's lot ever since. His time on earth is one long warfare with the forces of nature. Day by day he has to wrestle with them in order to force them to yield what is required to keep body and soul together during the short days of his earthly pilgrimage. This struggle, bitter as it is and will ever remain, is not the severest chastisement of man's folly in revolting from God. By his fall, man lost his hold on life and became a prey to all the ills of mortality. In breaking with God, man forfeited, along with integrity, the preternatural gift of immortality. The barriers to the tendency to dissolution inherent in the body were removed. The loss of perfect control exercised by the spiritual part of man over the corporal is the origin of death and of all the pains, dis-ease, and infirmity that precede and prepare the way for it. The life and well-being of the body, says St. Thomas, depend on its being subject to the influence of the soul, as that which is capable of perfection depends on that which perfects it. On the other hand, death and dis-ease and other corporal defects are caused by the absence of subjection of the body to the soul. Wherefore, just as the resistance of the flesh to the spirit is the chastisement of the sin of the first parents of the human race, so also is it as regards death and all bodily defects. As a chastisement of sin, man's earthly pilgrimage becomes a return to the dust from which his body was formed. God had warned Adam of this on the day he placed him in the paradise of delights. "Of the tree of knowledge of good and evil thou shalt not eat. For in what day soever thou shalt eat of it, thou shalt die the death." After the fall, the rebellious passions interfered with the functioning of the intellect, and even natural truths became difficult for man to seize. In the state of innocence, Adam enjoyed immense knowledge. He had infused science from the beginning. He added day by day to this initial stock of knowledge. His magnificent intelligence, undisturbed by passion, functioned freely and powerfully. Senses and imagination, being in a perfect state, faithfully served the intellect. The exterior world supplied a vast supply of objects for the exercise of thought. The attributes of the Creator were, without effort and with delight, deciphered from the scroll of creation spread before Adam's mental gaze. In those days the first man and woman drew from creatures far more satisfaction than does the sinner who greedily pursues them and places his beatitude in them. The due order in which external objects stood to sense and imagination, and these faculties in their turn to reason, was rudely disturbed by sin. The dark clouds of ignorance began to gather in the hitherto serene heaven of man's mind. The turbulence of the passions interfered with the play of reason. man began to find it difficult to contemplate steadily the truths that conflicted with his perverse inclinations. His judgments became uncertain, wavering, and false. The original light gradually faded. Knowledge declined. Error accumulated. The understanding was darkened. An inclination for the false developed. The good of man, says St. Thomas, is to be according to reason. Man lost his taste for this good, developing a sympathy for the opposing evil, for error. The sin of Adam was not one of sensuality, but of pride. To understand why the consequences of Adam's act were so disastrous, it is necessary to grasp the full significance of that act. It was no mere weak yielding to the attraction of a luscious and forbidden fruit. It was not the fruit itself that was the temptation, but the prospect that Satan held out to him as a consequence of the eating of the fruit. The head of the human race aimed at being as God. He yielded to the ambition of emulating the Almighty as regards the knowledge of good and evil. This meant the proud resolve to determine for himself, by his own native power, what should be good and what evil for him to do. He wished to be the rule of his own conduct. He would be the ultimate source, the very fount and origin of what was the true and what was the good for man. That what should be good for him was according to his own will, not what was according to the will of God. That should be true which recommended itself to his reason, not what was according to the divine ideas. Both Satan and Adam willed to be self-dependent to the contempt of the divine ruling, and from this point of view aimed at equality with God. The first man, in reaching out for the forbidden fruit, yielded to the ambition to be himself the artisan of his own beatitude. He hoped that by the resources of his own nature and of the world subject to his control, he could achieve his happiness without any dependence on a superhuman power. This was the beginning of that strange aberration traceable through the whole course of human history, the aberration that manifests itself in the perverse ambition of man to attain to the absolute by his own efforts. The fall, in the motive that inspired it, is ever being renewed down along the ages. Adam's act was a practical denial of the essential relation of dependence in which the creature stands to the Creator. It was a negation of his creaturehood. The eating from the tree of knowledge was a gesture of fearful import. It was a solemn declaration of human independence. It was equivalently an unfurling of the standard of revolt against God by the head of mankind, and on its behalf. The chief of the race was not unaware of the dreadful gravity of his act and of its consequences. The prohibition had been accompanied by solemn warnings and by the menace of dire consequences in case of its violation. The brief, simple, and unrhetorical narrative of Scripture gives us no insight into the tense and tragic struggle of soul that took place in the garden as Adam wrestled with a temptation proportioned to the grandeur of his endowments. It was a crisis on a scale unparalleled in history. On its issue hung the destinies of the whole human family. Adam had force and firmness of will, was endowed with penetration of intelligence, and enjoyed the intimate friendship of God. Alluring in the extreme must have been the colors of the destiny painted for him by Satan. Seeing that its appeal overcame the resistance of the strongest will and the mightiest intelligence that the world has ever known, save one exception. The temptation in the garden has its parallel and its contrast in the temptation of Christ in the desert. The fatal decision was taken, and the fair vision conjured up for Adam dissolved as an unsubstantial dream. There is no happiness unless through union with God. Man is doomed to misery when he ceases to depend on his Maker. When he turns his back on goods that are imperishable and divine, he develops a fatal tendency towards such as yield a satisfaction that is transient and ephemeral. Leaving the true good, which he can attain to by the aid of God, he falls a prey to a craving for the phantom good attainable by human resources.